Hey AP Lang teachers, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. Today is another installment of AP Lang Teacher Tip Tuesday, and today we are talking about 5 different approachable nonfiction texts that have not been used on the AP Lang exam. So these particular passages are Coach Hall tested and student approved. Anna Quindlen's The C Word in the Hallways is hands down one of my students' favorite texts each year. And I think part of it is not just because of her writing style, but also because of the topic itself and the way she handles it. So this particular article is about mental health in teenagers. And to be honest, this is a topic that a lot of my students really want to talk about. And I think this passage makes it a safe and accessible conversation. So from a rhetorical analysis standpoint, Anna Quindlen makes some rather obvious choices, but the passage itself is a really interesting read, and students really enjoy it. And oftentimes, it then leads to a conversation about the taboos that society has in terms of mental health. So I would definitely recommend asking yourself if this is appropriate for your students. It's not that the content itself is harmful, but you also need to consider the students that you have and your school environment. Offensive Play by Malcolm Gladwell is definitely a longer article. Each year that I've printed it out, my students have always commented on the length. This year we read it digitally and students kept scrolling and they're like, where does this end? So fair warning, it is on the longer side for a newspaper article. That being said, there's a lot to discuss with this particular piece. So this is a piece that deals with football and it examines the dangers of football. So as far as rhetorical choices, one of the ones that stands out the most that I didn't actually list here is comparison, because he compares football to dogfighting. But I think it's one where students can look at how he is structuring his argument, and it does lead to an interesting conversation about the dangers of football. So once students have read that particular article, I like to give them an article by Mark Feidelman. So that particular article is not actually in response to offensive play. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually in response to a different article that Gladwell wrote. But students like Feidelman's piece because, quite frankly, he takes a couple cheap shots at Gladwell, and students are often surprised by the tone. Also, it's much shorter, and students really appreciate that. So once students have read those 2 articles, I ask them to consider which author made a more convincing argument and why. This next recommendation is actually a passage that I found on CommonLit. So if you've never heard of CommonLit, it is a database of really great free resources. There's usually a passage and some multiple choice questions. So for this one, I just assigned the passage and we talk about it in class. I assigned it last year when we went to virtual instruction, and I actually had a few separate students email me and say, I really enjoyed this letter. And so I taught it again this year, but in the fall. And again, my students were like, hey, we really like this particular piece. So as a letter, it tends to have a very obvious rhetorical situation, and that is that Kurt Vonnegut is writing to the head of the Drake School Board in response to finding out that the school board burnt copies of his book, Slaughterhouse-Five, in their furnace. So not only do students get to examine the letter, they also get to have an interesting conversation about censorship. I was first introduced to Michael Levin's The Case for Torture a few years ago at an AP Lang Summer Institute. The presenter had us break down Michael Levin's argument and figure out what exactly he was advocating for and in what situations. So I try to follow a similar model with my students because, quite frankly, the title is a little bit shocking. And so I give my students a disclaimer that we are reading this particular passage, not because I do or don't agree with it, but rather because we are just trying to figure out what the author's argument is. And honestly, students are able to pick out the rhetorical choices rather easily. We have a conversation about his line of reasoning and whether it is or is not faulty in some places. And also, it leads to a really interesting conversation once students decide their position on this particular issue. I will say, though, this is definitely one that I would read first before assigning and just double check that it is something that would be appropriate at your school. I really enjoy incorporating historical speeches into my curriculum because I think it helps students start to foster these interdisciplinary connections between English and history. Also, in recent years, the College Board has been pulling either speeches or letters to put on their question 2 rhetorical analysis prompts. And I think part of that is because Letters and speeches tend to have a very obvious rhetorical situation, which makes them more approachable passages. And so these particular speeches are ones that my students have enjoyed in the past. I've listed them chronologically here. However, when I teach them, I actually group them a little bit differently. So I group them in pairs, and I start with FDR's Pearl Harbor speech, but then we move on to Bush's 9/11 speech. And the reason why I paired these two is because they are both speeches in response to an attack. So we look at the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical choices, and we talk about why the president made these choices, given what we know about the context and the exigence and the audience. And this really does sort of reinforce what they learn in history class as well. Now, the other two, these are lesser known events, but I grouped those two together. I start with Reagan's speech, and then we move on to Clinton's speech. And these are more of a speech in response to a tragedy. So we look at the difference between how presidents speak in response to an attack versus how they speak in response to a tragedy and how that affects their choices and their purpose, their message, things like that. If you are an AP Lang teacher and you are enjoying these teacher tip videos, I would love it if you would hit that like button to let me know that you want to keep seeing videos like this. Also, I would love to connect with you on your preferred social media platform, so the links to my social accounts are in the description box below. Until next time, guys, happy teaching!